In the 14th year of the reign of Pharaoh Amenhotep III, on the night of the festival of Opet, a young woman named Nefru, barely 15, stood in the inner sanctum of the temple of Karnak. She was clad in nothing but gold bands and sheer linen, trembling as the high priest approached. This chamber, unseen by commoners, was adorned with images of gods engaged in intimate acts. The high priest's words framed the moment. "You are Hathor tonight. You are the goddess of love, of desire. What happens in this chamber is not sin. It is the most sacred act in all of Egypt. Through you, the goddess herself will ensure the fertility of the Nile, the strength of Pharaoh, the continuation of Ma'at." Nefru, offered to the temple by her ambitious parents at age 12, had been prepared for 3 years to understand her body as a vessel for the divine, an act that later civilizations would deem unholy, but which was considered the highest form of worship in pharaonic Egypt. This ritual, performed over centuries, reveals a core truth about ancient Egypt. The elite systematically used religion and tradition to justify practices that served their desires and maintained their power, operating above the rules that bound common people. The foundation of this system was the royal family's belief or convenient claim of being literally descended from the gods. If the pharaoh possessed divine blood, normal human morality did not apply. What was wrong for a common person became acceptable, even sacred when performed by the god king. The most notorious manifestation of this was the practice of royal sibling marriage. In the 18th dynasty, it became standard for a pharaoh to marry his full sister. The theological justification, as recorded in temple texts, was to preserve the purity of divine blood, mirroring the sibling marriage of the gods Osiris and Isis. If the gods practiced it, the pharaoh, a part god, was obligated to do the same. However, this reasoning created immediate physical consequences. The reign of Akhenaten, Amenhotep IV, is a stark example. Married to his sister wife Nefertiti, they produced 6 daughters but no sons, leading to a succession crisis. Fragmentary evidence suggests Akhenaten sought a male heir by marrying his own daughters, such as Meritaten, perhaps 13 or 14, hoping their doubly divine blood would succeed where his primary marriage had not. This practice, though shocking to modern sensibilities, was seen as normal, even necessary. To preserve the divine kingship, the reality behind the theological justification was exposed. In the physical consequences of generational inbreeding, Tutankhamun, the boy king, was the product of a full sibling union and married his half-sister. Examination of his mummy revealed clear signs of genetic disorders resulting from this practice: a clubfoot, a cleft palate, and health issues that contributed to his early death at 19. Divine blood that was meant to make him superior instead made him physically weak and unable to produce healthy heirs. Yet the practice persisted because admitting it was harmful would have meant admitting the theological foundation of pharaonic power was false, that the pharaoh was just a man. Beyond publicly acknowledged sibling marriage, the elite indulged in practices during religious festivals that were both sacred and secret. The annual festival of Opet and the festival of drunkenness included public processions and celebrations, but the true mysteries unfolded behind closed doors in the inner sanctums. The unofficial reality was that the line between worship and physical pleasure did not truly exist in ancient Egypt. The divine act of creation, Adam creating the first gods through an act of self-pleasure, and Osiris and Isis conceiving Horus through an intimate union that restored life, was understood as inherently physical and sacred. Therefore, when priestesses like Nefru participated in rituals involving physical union with priests, or sometimes the pharaoh himself, representing the gods, it was considered theology made flesh, a literal reenactment of divine creation, a sympathetic magic to ensure the kingdom's fertility. The priestess became the goddess. The priest became the god. Girls, often from noble families, were offered to the temples. Between the ages of 6 and 12, they received a luxurious life, education, and high status, but in exchange, they became property of the temple. Their training was extensive, including ecstatic dance, music, and the use of herbs, like blue lotus and mandragora, to induce trance states and loosen the body. Initiation, usually around ages 13-15, involved anointing with powerful oils and consuming wine mixed with mind-altering herbs. The subsequent intimate act with the high priest was framed entirely in religious language, transforming what would otherwise be a crime into a sacred mystery. The girls were conditioned to believe their bodies were vessels for the goddess and that compliance was the highest honor, which made refusal unthinkable. For the young women, this system was a gilded cage. A priestess like Burl, who served during the reign of Rameses II, caught the elderly pharaoh's attention during the festival of drunkenness. She was elevated from temple priestess to royal concubine, receiving lavish gifts and bearing him children. However, upon the pharaoh's death, she was left exposed to the deadly politics of the royal harem. Her protection vanished, illustrating how the system, though elevating, offered no mechanism for security once a woman's usefulness to the powerful ended. The temple rituals were only one dimension of elite indulgence. Noble life itself was organized around pleasure, a meticulous culture of luxury and seduction. Elite homes were elaborate compounds designed for comfort and entertainment, filled with scented oils, myrrh, lotus, cinnamon, and elaborate wigs and cosmetics. Both men and women used coal malachite and ochre, viewing physical attractiveness not as vanity, but as a form of power to be cultivated. Clothing, often of transparent linen, was designed to both conceal and reveal, and heavy jewelry served as both wealth display and erotic ornament, drawing attention to the body's contours. Elite social gatherings, like evening banquets, were carefully orchestrated to stimulate all the senses. Guests reclined amid incense, wine, and elaborate food. Musicians and dancers performed movements that became increasingly suggestive as the night wore on. Flirtation was expected. Affairs and dalliances were common and largely accepted among the elite, as long as they didn't threaten property or the legitimacy of heirs. Servants and even eunuchs played a crucial role, their duty absolute. They provided services from grooming and massage to intimate companionship when commanded, a stark reminder that the entire social structure was built on the premise that the needs of the powerful took precedence over the rights of the weak. The story of Senmut, the commoner who rose to be the chief steward and rumored lover of the female Pharaoh Hatshepsut, shows the rare ascent possible through intimate access to power. But his disappearance and the vandalism of his tomb after her death reveal the precarity of that position. The ultimate embodiment of this enduring system was Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh, a Ptolemaic queen who retained the Greek culture of her ancestors but fully embraced the Egyptian mantle of divinity. She understood the power of presentation. When meeting Julius Caesar and later Mark Antony, she presented herself as the living incarnation of the goddess Isis, using spectacles of luxury and seduction as instruments of political policy. Her intimate relationships with these Roman leaders were calculated alliances, utilizing the ancient Egyptian tradition of the divine queen granting her favor to secure power. The elite practices of ancient Egypt, the incestuous marriages, the sacred sexual rituals, the culture of indulgence were successful for 3 millennia because they were not random acts of corruption, but a systematic framework. This framework was protected by religious conditioning. Those being exploited, particularly the priestesses, were taught from childhood that their use was a sacred duty, the highest honor. Material incentives, temple service, and concubinage provided luxury and protection not available to commoners. Theological justification, practices that benefited the powerful, were framed as necessary for the welfare of the entire kingdom and the continuation of Ma'at. This is the nature of elite corruption across history. Not simple cruelty, but sophisticated systems justified by the highest religious and moral ideals, where the practices serving the powerful are deemed sacred, and questioning them is equated with attacking the very foundations of civilization. The preceding narrative described the systematic use of religious authority and tradition by the Egyptian elite to justify practices that served their power and desires, focusing on royal inbreeding and the use of priestesses in temple rituals. The next logical section, hinted at in the original text, should elaborate on 2 final, interconnected topics that reveal the full scope of elite indulgence and its religious justification. The festival of drunkenness. a detailed look at the public and private aspects of this celebration, emphasizing how it served as a socially sanctioned cover for unrestrained behavior and elite pleasure, the intertwining of pleasure and the afterlife, an explanation of how the Egyptian belief in a physically experienced afterlife legitimized the pursuit of earthly pleasure, even in intimate acts, as being continuous with divinity. The festival of drunkenness, Tek, was an annual celebration dedicated to the goddess Hathor, particularly at her temple in Dendera. It was founded on a central myth. The primordial goddess Hathor, in a drunken rage, nearly destroyed humanity. She was only stopped when the god Ra tricked her into drinking vast quantities of beer dyed red to look like blood, causing her to pass out. The festival's stated religious purpose was to honor Hathor and ensure her benevolence by recreating this divine intoxication, preventing her destructive tendencies for another year. The festival lasted for several days and nights, beginning with public processions but transitioning into the inner temple courtyards where access was restricted to the nobility, priests and their guests. Divine madness. The core ritual involved excessive consumption of wine and beer, often mixed with substances like blue, lotus and other herbs that intensified their effects, inducing states of euphoria and altered perception that were understood as divine possession. The goal was to literally drink until one forgets the bad dream, the myth of Hathor's rage, dissolving boundaries. This religious imperative served as a socially sanctioned release for the elite. Away from public view, normal social rules were temporarily dissolved. The atmosphere fueled by alcohol, music, and the ecstatic dancing of barely clothed priestesses was designed to stimulate the senses. The inner sanctum. As the night progressed, private gatherings in garden pavilions and side chambers occurred. Priests and nobles engaged in acts that, to an outsider, would be indistinguishable from orgies, but were justified by the participants as the sacred repetition of the divine marriage, the ultimate creative act. For the elite, the ability to engage in such uninhibited behavior under the cloak of religious duty was a mark of their privileged initiation into the mysteries. The next morning, participants returned to their dignified roles, the priests to the temple, the nobles to administration, maintaining the dual identity that separated the powerful from the common, respectable official by day, uninhibited celebrant of divine mysteries by night. The enduring power of these indulgent practices was reinforced by the Egyptian concept of the afterlife, which was not viewed as a purely spiritual realm but as a physical continuation of earthly existence. Sensory restoration, the eternal banquet. Tomb paintings and inscriptions frequently depicted the deceased enjoying the exact pleasures they had in life. Elaborate banquets with wine and food, the company of beautiful servants, and entertainment by musicians. These were not mere symbolic representations. They reflected the belief that the afterlife for the privileged included all the sensory experiences that made life enjoyable, restoring the body, the elaborate mummification process in the opening of the mouth. Ceremony were focused on restoring physical sensation, the ability to eat, drink, speak, see, smell, and feel in the afterlife. The spells recited explicitly aimed to ensure the deceased would not be a ghost, but a complete being capable of experiencing the full range of earthly pleasures, including potency and intimate union. The divine logic of desire. This seamless integration of body and spirit meant that pleasure was not sinful or opposed to purity. It was part of the divine creation. Since life, even the divine life of the gods like Osiris and Isis, involved physical intimate acts, the pursuit and enjoyment of physical pleasure in life was considered a natural, even necessary demonstration of aligning oneself with the cosmic order. This belief provided the final, ultimate religious justification for elite sexual practices. By indulging in life's pleasures, often to excess, they were honoring the divine creative energy, ensuring they would carry that vitality and sensory capacity into an eternity where their physical bodies would be fully restored. The lengthy narrative has established the systematic, religiously justified indulgence of the ancient Egyptian elite. The final section should address the narrative's conclusion, the judgment of these practices by later civilizations and the ethical dilemma of evaluating them today. While the system was framed as sacred, not all practices were universally accepted, and power enabled genuine exploitation. Abuse of authority, hints from later Egyptian texts and foreign accounts suggest that the religious justifications were often abused. Priests were accused of using the requirement for ritual purity as a pretext for excessive and unnecessary intimate contact with young priestesses, serving their own gratification under the guise of religious duty. Decadence over piety. Greek and Roman visitors, writing centuries after Egypt's height, described temple celebrations, particularly the Festival of Drunkenness, as purely hedonistic festivals where any genuine religious significance had been lost. They painted a picture of gatherings designed for elite indulgence, conducted under the convenient cover of tradition. These hints suggest an internal awareness, particularly in later periods of dynastic decline, that the line between sacred ritual and cynical exploitation was often blurred, with religious power being used to validate and mask personal desires. Later civilizations viewed Egyptian elite practices through a lens of moral disapproval that often reflected their own cultural biases and anxieties. Greek and Roman disapproval. Historians like Herodotus expressed shock at sibling marriage and explicit temple practices, often using them as evidence of Egyptian barbarism despite their sophistication. Roman writers continued this tradition, often connecting the perceived moral decline and excessive indulgence of the Egyptian court to the kingdom's eventual fall. The Christian conflict. The rise of Christianity in Egypt saw a dramatic ideological clash. Egyptian culture's open celebration of physical pleasure was seen by Christian monks and ascetics as the epitome of paganism and corruption. They responded with extreme practices of self-denial and bodily mortification, framing the Egyptian emphasis on physical restoration in the afterlife as antithetical to spiritual purity. This conflict deeply influenced how European Christianity would view Egyptian sexuality for the next 2 millennia. Modern reevaluation. Early European archaeologists, shaped by Victorian-era prudishness, often suppressed or sanitized explicit tomb paintings and texts. Today, scholars are more willing to acknowledge these aspects of Egyptian culture, but the challenge remains: how to interpret practices that were sacred to their creators but involved clear elements of coercion and exploitation by modern standards. The stories of individuals like the young priestess Nefru or the concubine Beryl force a critical question: how do we judge an ancient, deeply entrenched system of power? The answer is complex and uncomfortable. They were both victims and participants. Exploitation. Individuals like Nefru were undoubtedly harmed by a system that gave them no real choice, channeling them into temple service at a young age and using their bodies for purposes they didn't control. Their autonomy was fundamentally constrained. Conditioning. Yet they were also raised since childhood to believe in the religious framework that their actions were necessary for Ma'at, that they were achieving the highest possible honor, and that compliance was a sacred duty. They may have found genuine meaning, status, and even satisfaction within the roles their culture had deemed vital. The ultimate secret of the Egyptian elite was not mere licentiousness, but the successful, long-lasting integration of power, pleasure, and religious authority. They built a sophisticated system where practices that exclusively served the powerful were framed as necessary for the collective welfare. Those being exploited were taught that their exploitation was sacred duty. Questioning the system was equated with attacking the very foundation of civilization. This pattern, where elites use ideology to create rules that exempt them from common morality, remains a dark constant in human history, making the secrets of the pharaohs a relevant study of power dynamics even today. The narrative has explored how the ancient Egyptian elite integrated power, desire, and religious authority over 3 millennia. The final conclusion summarizes the ethical paradox, addresses the nature of the exploitation, and extracts the enduring historical lesson from the pharaohs' secrets. The core of the Egyptian elite system lies in an uncomfortable ethical paradox. Practices we recognize as exploitative were simultaneously held by the culture as sacred and necessary. The pharaoh's duty, the royal family's practices, such as sibling marriage leading to figures like Tutankhamun's ill health, and ritual unions with priestesses were not viewed as personal depravity. They were seen as obligations to Ma'at, cosmic order, justice, and truth, essential for renewing the divine kingship and guaranteeing the Nile's flood and Egypt's prosperity. The theological justification was always suspiciously aligned with the political goal, keeping power, wealth, and legitimacy concentrated within a single small bloodline. The priestess's reality, young women like Nefru, channeled into temple service, lived a life of material privilege and high status. However, this luxury was predicated on the understanding that their bodies were property and vessels for the goddess to be used in rituals they had been conditioned since childhood to accept as the highest honor. The system was designed to eliminate the perception of choice, transforming coercion into a sacred duty. We cannot fully divorce these practices from the historical context that validated them, but neither can we ignore the evidence of imbalance of power and systematic abuse. Cultural relativism versus harm. While cultural relativism demands acknowledging that different times had different moral frameworks, modern ethics struggles to reconcile this with the apparent harm done to the young and less powerful. The reality is that the systems of ancient Egypt successfully utilized religious authority and material incentive to make exploitation palatable and even desirable to its subjects. The tool of religion. The ultimate historical lesson is how the elite class successfully weaponized religion. They didn't just break the rules, they created an entire ideological framework where the satisfaction of their desires, sexual, material, political, was codified as divine necessity. The festival of drunkenness is the perfect metaphor for this. Elite indulgence was literally required to keep the world safe from a vengeful goddess. The enduring secrets of the Pharaohs are not merely tales of sex and decadence. They reveal a calculated and self-serving political mechanism, the creation of a sacred aristocracy where the powerful successfully elevated their private interests and appetites into the highest forms of public virtue and religious worship. This pattern of using religious and traditional justification to insulate the elite from common morality remains a vital and dark theme across human history. The narrative concludes with the enduring lesson of the Egyptian elite's success, the ability to integrate power, pleasure, and religious authority into a self-perpetuating system that lasted for 3 millennia. This final summary synthesizes the key themes of exploitation and justification and offers a concluding reflection on their historical relevance. The blueprint of elite power. The Egyptian elite, pharaohs, priests, and high-ranking nobles created a system where their privileges were not merely tolerated, but declared sacred duty. This was achieved through 3 interlocking practices: theological justification for inbreeding, royal sibling marriage, and even father-daughter marriage were rationalized as necessary to maintain the pure, divine blood of the pharaoh, who was considered a living god. This justification conveniently kept political power and wealth concentrated within the smallest possible circle, despite the visible physical harm, e.g. in Tutankhamun. Sacralization of intimacy. Temple rituals, particularly during major festivals like Opet and the Festival of Drunkenness, transformed intimate acts into essential religious rites. Young priestesses were conditioned and utilized as vessels of the goddess Hathor or Isis, making their exploitation an act of Ma'at, cosmic order, necessary for the kingdom's fertility. A culture of permissible indulgence. Elite social life characterized by elaborate luxury, the use of substances like Blue Lotus and Mandragore, and a flexible view of marriage was designed to cater to desire. The afterlife itself was promised as a continuation of physical pleasure, further legitimizing earthly indulgence. The ethical and historical legacy. The system's longevity was based on its psychological and social controls. Coercion as ceremony. Individuals like the priestess Nefru were denied agency, yet simultaneously offered high status and security, conditioning them to accept their constrained roles as the highest possible honor. The threat of social and material collapse, like the fate of concubine Borel, enforced compliance. A timeless lesson. The ultimate historical significance of these practices is not their shocking nature, but the mechanism by which they functioned. The ancient Egyptian elite successfully weaponized religion and tradition to create an ideological shield that rendered their most self-serving and potentially harmful acts unchallengeable by common morality. The secrets of the pharaohs illustrate a universal principle of power. The powerful rarely simply ignore the rules. They create a superior set of sacred rules that exempt them from the constraints placed upon everyone else.